Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and the last show of this week. And just to let you know, the reason we didn't do the show with Kate yesterday is various things were going on, but it's going to happen on Monday. So, in fact, we've got an incredible double bill for you on Monday. Kate Viger's talking about Mission SOE in the morning, and then Stephen Fisher talking about Sword Beach and the taking of Ouistreham in the evening. So, an absolute fantastic double header. As always, I remind people don't forget to click, like, and subscribe. Consider becoming a patron and buy my guests' books. A, it helps keep them afloat financially, and B, it makes them encourage them to write more books, which is good for everybody. But anyway, with a story of sacrifice, a powerful family bond, and an untold chapter of the Pacific Theatre, I'm delighted to be joined by Emerson Ford to talk about her book, What the Silence Say. And as of course, always, the links to buy the book are in the description below, or you can find it at your favorite bookstore. But I'll bring her in now. Good afternoon. How are you today?
Doing well. How are you?
I'm good. So, well, we kind of started the chat already, just waiting to go live there. But what we will definitely get into later on is the whole process of when an author, writer, historian, researcher finds a book or finds a subject they think could be a book. Is what route do you take with it? Do you take it to be a bit of non-fiction, classic non-fiction? Do you think about doing a screenplay? Some people do that. Or do you go the route of historical fiction or novels? And we'll get into that later on. But before we get into that, which kind of half asks the questions, how do you define yourself? Because we have your classic military historians here, we have researchers, profilers, storytellers. Do you have a particular label you like?
I like storyteller, but it's a title that I stumbled upon. It's not something I ever thought of for myself. I always loved history, especially World War II history. I loved English. My degrees are in English literature. Never expected to write, but I did find these letters in my father's desk one day, and there was a feeling that I had that this sadness, that this was all that we had left of this person, just these pieces of paper. And if there a fire or uninterested heirs inherited them, then that would be gone. This person, they would just disappear, and I didn't want that. I wanted to bring them to life again. And so I stumbled into this title of storyteller. I just happened to love history all my life, absorbed every bit that I could. And so really became a writer because of my love for history and for the stories of untold heroes, really, untold stories of unsung heroes.
And I think we'll get into it later on. But one of the things that has come up frequently on this channel from some of the sidebar warriors there is people feel they've got a story. I mean, there's Darren Little is often in a chat whose grandfather, most of his grandparents are involved in the Burma campaign, but it's like, well, I can't write a book, or I don't want to talk in front of people, or maybe I don't think the story is interesting enough on a broad appeal. It's only really my family who are interested in it. And I think when you find the right way of communicating a story, and we've had some great guests on the channel, Layla Sen, Barnaby Jameson, who have gone through the route of historical fiction. And we'll get into what the difference is between historical fiction and novels, because there's a blurring of the lines that I don't know that I understand. And then you have based on a true story, inspired by a true story, and it gets a bit complicated. But I think people like yourself who have found a route to getting a story out there are in themselves inspirational, and your route won't be somebody's route, but it might be someone else's route, and there's always a way of conveying history. It's just finding that way there. So we'll bring up your slides, and we'll what we'll do, folks, is kind of do a bit of a presentation, tell a bit of the story first, then we'll just kind of do an open free-for-all discussion about what we were saying about writing and choice of how to approach a subject. But I'm going to hand over to Emerson to kind of just give a little bit of a rundown of the project and what the book's about.
Sure. So as I hinted at earlier, this really all started with these letters that I found. And there was always a little bit of a mystery as to what exactly happened. My grandfather didn't like to talk about his brother and what happened. And so we don't know well, we know now which
Mm.
is one of the best things that came out of this story. It was the search for what exactly happened over there and what happened between the two of them. And so, as we know, so many veterans were hesitant to talk about their experiences for obvious reasons. And so I didn't get the story from my grandfather. So I had to figure it out on my own. And so the story itself is it's really the journey that I took to bring uh, these two men, my grandfather and my uncle, back to life again. And that was my one goal. And to me, historical fiction was the best way to do that. I could just say, they went here, they did this, they did that. But that's not the heart of who they
Mm.
were. And so I wanted to feel like I knew them. And I knew my grandfather, my uncle, but I didn't know them. And now, having written this, I feel like they are alive. And it was a gift I wanted to give to my father as well, because this mystery, he'd been on a search for way longer than I had ever been
Mm.
on it. So he started it years before. And so it was a gift to him. I wanted to uh, bring them to life for him as well. So, uh, in my office, I have hanging this quote from The Wanderer, which is a 10th century poem. Where is the horse gone? Where has the warrior gone? How that time has passed away, dark under the cover of night, as if it had never been. And there are so many stories out there, just like my grandfathers and uncles, that are just not told. These men
Yeah.
are and women are gone. Their stories are buried, and so uh, that's a tragedy in my book. It grieves me that they're gone, and we'll never know their stories again unless people like me, you, us, we do that work to dig it up again and bring it back to life, because it's worth it. They deserve that honor, and they deserve not to be forgotten. So this quote drives me. This is why
Mm.
I write.
And I think that's what, it's what you said about the story, and that I've read a lot of memoirs compiled by families or by veterans or friends of veterans that really end up being either like a scrapbook with words, which can be interesting, or
Yes.
they are an expanded kind of diary with lots of dates and enlisted at, trained at, took train to, got boat at, returned with, here are the medals, which can be informative, and they leave a record for a family, but they don't necessarily tell a story. And it's the
Mm,
point is that we will all remember stories going forward. We won't necessarily remember the dates and the facts and figures. And I think that's why, we'll get into it later on, finding a point of what you want to get across with a story, and having a beginning, a middle, and an end, I think is absolutely key. And the same applies to nonfiction as well. Is what's the point you're trying to make?
right.
And I think that's something that you've obviously addressed. And yeah, brilliant stuff. Back to you.
All right. So then the last quote that I wanted to share is something from Julius Caesar. The evil that men do lives after them. The good is often interred with their bones, which is again the problem here, right? We their stories are buried. We want to unearth their stories for us. And why? Why do we want to know these stories? What good does it do us to know them? Well, they're acts of heroism, and there are so many, by the way. They're not just limited to silver stars and medals of honor. There are many, many, many men who I would argue deserve those medals, but just for many reasons have not received them. So it's the heroism, yes, but it's the perseverance in those times, those really dark times. And that's a human condition. We can all relate to
Yeah.
that. We can all relate to what does it take to get through this dark time? And these men and women, we have, stories of women too, who were examples to us. But they persevered, the courage that it took. I think it's valuable for all of us. So I'm sorry, go ahead.
I just said here. That's what I said. Yeah,
Oh,
no.
okay.
Sorry.
So as far as the story itself, what's interesting is I delved into the story. First, I wanted to figure out the mystery. And then I discovered, well, incredible. We've got this one of them, Jimmie Sellers, who is a part of the Blue Raiders, VPD 117. And they're not a part of the typical bomber squadrons that are being escorted by fighters to bomb, and they're thousands of feet up in the air. Instead, they're by themselves, one plane, and they're patrolling the ocean, just a few feet above. Really, they could feel the ocean spray coming into their windows as they are. So they're by themselves. They're traveling 1,000 miles and 1,000 miles back. So 2,000 miles by themselves in the dark over the Pacific Ocean. So there was a lot there to delve into, and it was fascinating learning the story. And by the way, Tokyo Rose was the one who gave them the name Blue Raiders, which, as we know, there is no one Tokyo Rose. It's a conglomerate of, so that was fascinating in and of itself. So I got the bonus of not only figuring out more about Jimmie, but also about the Blue Raiders. And then Raymond Sellers is the other brother, and he was a part of the 77th Division, which has an unbelievable beginning and story overall. And so that really has been the main focus for me in this book. The book became about the 77th Division secondarily to the brothers and the mystery between them. And here are some other of the characters who appear in this story. So 77th Division here, we have a few pictures here. Now, the 77th Division, they first fought in Guam alongside of the Marines. Then they went to the Philippines and then Okinawa. And so they have there's a lot of history to discuss there, so I won't get started.
Well, I mean, that is just interesting that thanks to the work of John McManus, the US Army units in the Pacific have, after 75 years, got their due understanding and recognition, because even as a Brit, I grew up, it was all about the Marines in the Pacific. That's all we heard. And the Army divisions that were there and did, let's not beat about the bush, they did more amphibious invasions than the Marines. And we love the Marines. The Marines are fantastic, but the Army out there were overlooked for a long time. And yeah, as you say, Guam, Okinawa, these are legendary bits of action.
And that was another heartache for me, is that most of the focus has been on Europe, which is understandable and for good reason. But in my opinion, I felt like the Pacific was not as much attention has been paid to it. And so and there are reasons for that, and there are reasons for the Marines getting more of the attention over there, good reasons. They had to basically, they were protecting their survival, and so they embedded photographers, and they had people who would make sure that we knew how important the Marines were, and because they were thinking about folding them in to the Army. Why have the Marines when we have the Army? And they said, well, we'll show you. So they were very good about documenting their experience. And so I think that's why we have a lot of information about them. But the 77th, unbelievable. And I'm so glad we have the story of Desmond Doss, which helped get the 77th more on the radar, which before it wasn't as much. And so that has been incredible. And just, I just want to say it had such rich fodder for my book, because we had the average age of the soldier put into the 77th was 33, which ancient by Army standards, right? So, and then we had these rough and tumble New Yorkers, construction workers, and, we have them. And then we have these mild-mannered, not really mild-mannered, but we have these Southern officers who they have to come together and create this totally new, the 77th also fought in World War I, but it was deactivated. So they reactivated it. So anyways, don't get me started. I could go on for quite a while about the 77th. And here's a slide on the Blue Raiders solo into the rising sun. If you're curious about the Blue Raiders, fantastic book. If you're looking for more of a nonfiction treatment of the Blue Raiders. So should I stop here for a second? Or
no, but we've got the slide. Do a bit more about the research, then we'll bounce around and bring up some of the slides again later on. But yeah, carry on for the time being. It's good. I'm enjoying it.
All right. So as I mentioned earlier, well, how would you put it? I was not a historian per se. It wasn't my profession, but I was a lifelong lover of history and researcher of history. So it felt very exciting and natural to delve into it for this book. So we went to, you can see my dad there on the screen with me. He is my sidekick, my research I wouldn't even call him an assistant. He was right there beside me figuring out the story as we went. So that was at the National Archives. And I don't know if you can, I don't have a pointer, but in the upper right-hand corner, you can see the history. These messages that were passed on the battlefield, they have the mud stains still on them. The dirt stains. I can't tell you what it was like to put my hands on that. So as far as I know, I had my hands on every single piece of paper that the National Archives had on the 77th in the Blue Raiders. And we have so much, which is going to be part of the problem with writing historical fiction, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But so the research process was exciting and life-giving and frustrating, because you can't find exactly what you want, and then you find other things that are fascinating, and you go off on all these rabbit trails. But it was wonderful. And on that particular research trip, we did find out exactly what happened, which was incredible. One of the best memories of my life, for sure. Seeing all the pieces come together, and I couldn't believe that it was there. So as far as writing historical fiction itself, it's interesting, because there's writing historical fiction, and then there's writing historical fiction based on a true story. So I would argue that it's more difficult to write on a true story, on a real person, because you're limited by what actually happened. They went here, they did this. You can't really wiggle your way out of that with your imagination if it doesn't work for the story. So that is part of the struggle with writing historical fiction. So you have to decide, what is the spirit of the story? Do I want to stick to the spirit of the story or the letter of the story? For me, I would say that I stuck to the letter of the story when I started. And then as I went on, I realized there were times I needed to stick to the spirit of the story. So that sometimes meant introducing some characters who are completely fictional because we don't know all the answers. I couldn't interview these men. So, and these women, there are a few women in this book as well. So there were some holes that I just would never be able to fill. And so I had to, for the sake of the story, I had to use my imagination. That was the fun part. I could just, but it had to fit the facts. I never wanted to go outside of what actually happened. So that's my last point. Don't deviate from the heartbeat. What is the heartbeat of the story? Who were these men? What is the story itself? And so you don't ever want to do something crazy.
Yeah.
Because to me, historical fiction is about reviving history. That's and preserving history. It's just in a different way. It's not nonfiction. But it connects with our emotions and our imagination to put us there, and it's a completely different experience, and I think it's a worthwhile experience. I think we relate, admire, and love these people even more because of it. So why do we research? As I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of research, especially with World War II. There's so much out there. So it can be very easy to get overwhelmed. And so the main point, you got to avoid those inaccuracies. And your research has to serve the story itself. That is the most important thing. If you don't do that, then it's not historical fiction. It turns into nonfiction. So as an example, I wrote a part of this book, What the Silence Say, talking about the Marianas campaign, because I found all this incredible information and I wanted my readers to know it too. But it just turned into this historical diatribe. And it was like fiction, nonfiction, then back to fiction. So I learned how to cut some of that out. That can be sprinkled in through the story. So these are just a few. I don't want to overtake the interview here, but some ideas about writing historical fiction.
Well, we can go back to some of the slides we need to later on, and we've got some questions coming. And I think you used the word for the readers, and I think one of the things I want to get down to is obviously as a student of English literature. So you reading the great classics, things like that. You have an understanding of who was writing for what. Who was Oscar Wilde writing for? Was he writing for himself? Was he writing for an audience? Herman Melville, whoever it would be, Joseph Heller writing Catch-22. So one of the things we know in bookstores around the world is historical fiction is in a different place usually to the non-fiction. So if you want to get a book about the 77th Division, you would go to the World War II section and you'd look for the Pacific and you'd find, there's John McManus who's written about that. There's historical fiction tends to be in a different part of the store. So do you think different people read historical fiction to read non-fiction? I know there are people in the sidebar who do both, but do you think there is a distinction?
I do. I think historical fiction makes history accessible to everyone, which is important, very important. And so not everyone wants to read a textbook, and that's fine. I do. I enjoy it. But that doesn't, I know that's not everyone, but I think stories in and of themselves capture everybody. It's how we pass down our history since the beginning of time. We pass down story orally in our history that way, and so this is just another form of doing that.
Yeah. Well, that was one of the first comments that came in. Alt92 said, storytelling is the core to human memory and history. It's what began as song and rhyme, then transcribed. It serves as a coat rack to dates and events. And I think that's from
Yes.
cave paintings to the oral tradition to the counting, the counting of the coup or whatever it was that's passed on by Native American. That's the tradition, is it? That we're going to the pyramids and hieroglyphics and all that kind of stuff. But is that storytelling and leaving a message there, which comes back to this whole this idea of who are you writing for and for what purpose? And the thing about some of the non-fiction books is that, World War II is our field here on World War II TV, is there's sometimes can be a bit of required back pre-knowledge to get the most
Right.
out of it. That you have a basic understanding of the geography of the Pacific campaign, for example, and how the logistics work and who are the commanders and how does a chain of command go. And there are people watching this who, when they launch into a John McManus or a James Holland or Ian W. Toll about that theater, they've got that knowledge. But when I don't read much fiction, but when I do, it's tend to be books given to me by my stepdaughters, and they know, they always take me out of my comfort zone. But I always find that I don't need to know the backstory, because what you need to know is the people. It's who are the people and what are the motivations of the people, and it's the people that drive it. And now the best authors can do both. The best non-fiction writers keep it about people set in a backdrop of war, but clearly from what you were saying, you wanted to tell the story of these people through World War II and also inform about World War II, but not in a way that's inaccessible to people, because, we were talking before going live, your reviews on Amazon, almost no one mentions the war. What they mention is, oh, the story broke my heart. The story was so uplifting. I was mesmerized. You don't seem to have yet got the kind of the military people who are going, well, I think she might have got to do, it was the USS that had changed its name in 1942 to this.
Yeah.
Because that kind of thing happens to the best of us. So, who do you want to read your book? Let's go with that.
It was very important to me that both men and women wanted to read my book. We've all seen the historical fiction. There's nothing wrong with it, but we have the woman with her back turned to the audience and she's looking off in the distance, and that's great. And it has its audience and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But I knew I would lose half of my audience right away with a woman being on the cover. Well, I mean, I'm making assumptions here. But so it was very important to me because I felt like this history was for everybody, and I wrote this book for everybody. So it's really, I think my publisher has done an incredible job with seeing my vision for it and running with it. And I think it shows with the cover, because it has the main character on the cover, which he's not a woman. So so that's a hard, but I also wanted younger people to read it, and I wanted them to catch that interest in those who came before and our history, because I'm seeing it. I also teach, and I see, I'm getting little whispers now of students who will say, well, what was that? Or World War II, wasn't that like, I don't know, the 1900s, early 19, and I'm like, oh no. So I want to keep it alive in our collective memory. That's part of my goal.
I mean, that's one of the things where we often discuss is that the audience, possibly for the classic military histories, blow by blow, the fleet left at, and it comprised of the following ships, and the audience for that may be dying off slightly. I don't know. People are taking and absorbing the history in different ways. YouTube, TikTok, podcasts like never before. And there are still people selling huge amounts of books in military history, but it might not necessarily be what people are doing in the 20 and 30 years time. And historical fiction is definitely a thing. Now, one of the things I'm a little bit loath to dip my toe fully in the water historical fiction is there's that kind of what I call the awful historical fiction, which is where it's kind of the romantic kind of pop, where it's written by women, but it's kind of a romance where it's about a Spitfire pilot who kind of fights in the Battle of Stalingrad in the morning, then goes to North Africa in the afternoon and kind of lands his Spitfire in the girl's garden, and they make wild, passionate love out of a haystack. Then he goes back in the aircraft and goes and wins the Battle of. There are books like that I have seen out there that that's not doing anybody any good. Although maybe if people are enjoying them, I suppose that's fine. But there is that darker side of World
Yes.
War II writing, which clearly is not where we're going, but it does exist. That
I do want to say, it needs to be said, I am a military spouse. And so it was important to me to bring alive the story of the home front at the same time.
yeah.
But I did not want it to be that kind of Pearl Harbor grand romance in the sunset kind of thing. Nothing wrong with that. There is romance in my book for sure, but that's
Yeah.
part of the human life. I mean, that's part of the the dessert, the cherry on top that makes
Yeah.
life so wonderful.
I
So
mean, and this is where the art of explaining World War II is changing, in that the trend seems to be for these all-encompassing things. As Indy Nidell on his channel says, nothing happens in a vacuum. And whereas in the past people were writing about the Blue Raiders specifically, and this is their unit history from formation to disbandment, with nothing about the home life, nothing about how the people got there, nothing about the trend where people like John Parshall's 1942 book is coming out next year, Alan Allport's writing, Jonathan Fennell's writing, is more that what's happening is here is affecting there. So the people are getting the news from here. So that means they're working harder in the factories, which means they're doing this. And that when public opinion is in this place, people are going to more dances and parties. So they're meeting people. So they're having more romances. So that way of looking at World War II from all directions, I think that's clearly what you were doing with this book, is that it's not a battle book or a home front book or a war chronology or a romance, but it has elements of all of them.
correct. Exactly. So, I will be honest, I've gotten several reviews from people, from women who said, well, I'm not the hugest fan of battle scenes, and I've got quite a few in my book. And they said, but it was really important to the story to read those, and it was necessary. So I think even the people who don't maybe care for the romance, maybe don't care for the battle scenes, hopefully it's all put together in a way that brings the story to life and is still enjoyable.
Yeah, which is kind of the art of historical fiction, is that the people will remember the bits that appeal to them particularly. And some people, probably myself, would probably naturally enjoy the battle scenes and the reference to the 77th Division more. But that doesn't mean I can't get all soppy and like a bit of romance on us as well. So we've got a few questions coming, which I'd like to address some of them. We can go back. So, well, comments and questions. So David Levine is just saying, as I recall, John McManus spoke very highly of the 77th Division on one of his presentations. Well, you know why that is, David? It's because their first commander was Robert Eichelberger, who is John McManus's favorite general of World War II. So he had them for 6 months in 1942. I forget who the general was for the bulk part of their career, but that's why John McManus likes the 77th, because so that's just a comment there. But Trevor's a great question from Trevor. Good to see you a couple of weeks ago, Trevor, in London. That was great. Were there any books or movies that inspired Emerson's writing and or book structure? Great question.
That is a good question, and I'll tell you what I did. I don't necessarily recommend it. I did not read any World War II historical fiction before I read this book, purposefully. I didn't want any other types of storylines dancing around in my head or influencing what I wrote. I really just wanted to stick to the story, what actually happened. And I was really afraid that I would be influenced by that. So I don't really have any, although I will say that, of course, Saving Private Ryan, the heart of those battlefield scenes, and the relationship between the men, the camaraderie, of course, that was hugely at the forefront of my mind I wanted to recreate that reality, not Saving Private Ryan, but that camaraderie between the men.
No, that exactly. It's that's I think all the years down the line, maybe some of the battle recreations seem a little bit old hat in Saving Private Ryan now because the emotional story, like we said earlier, will continue on. The loss of three brothers and one surviving, that is an eternal story that can be applicable, that just happened to be set in World War II. So there are people in the sidebar debating what is historical fiction, what is war historical fiction. There's a big one about whether the Lord of the Rings counts as being a war historical fiction. Well, I suppose it does. I mean, the backdrop is wars, so I wouldn't have necessarily thought about it as being war historical fiction, but I suppose it is.
Wow, that is that is very interesting. So in my mind, historical fiction is based on some true event, some period in history that really happened. Lord of the Rings is wonderfully, fantastically from the mind of Tolkien, which is great. But this, I may be dipping my toes into controversial waters, but I maybe wouldn't call it historical fiction.
Well, I think all our parameters will be different. I mean, one of the things that rocked my world when I found out is, as a big fan of interested in the Battle of Market Garden and Arnhem, is Watership Down, which I grew up understanding about being about rabbits trying to find a new. The author of that had been in the Battle of Market Garden, and it was all the figures in that are based on real military figures in the Battle of Market Garden. And that was like that was two parts of my world that I thought were in separate lanes came crashing together when I found out 20 years ago. And it was like, oh, so it's not just about rabbits then. But like Animal Farm isn't just about pigs in a farm, is it? So
yes.
So I mean, Animal Farm, is that historical fiction? I suppose no, but also could be, depending on your parameters.
I bet we could. I bet we could make a case for it. And as we know, Tolkien fought in World War I. He was at the Battle of the Somme, and so I'm
echoes of
right. And so, although he probably would not make much of his time there with what he wrote, and he didn't. He a little bit. I think we could probably say that it did influence the battle themes in Lord of the Rings. So there you go. There's a connection.
Yeah, no, we'd never get the parameters sorted out. Just a couple other comments are coming in. Mr. Frickin' Fracken is saying something well written will always be read, no matter if historical fiction or hard history. Yeah, that's it. It's either written well or it's written badly, and there are examples of both. Greg is saying Herman Wouk, Winds of War, fictional history or historical fiction? Again, I don't know. I mean, because they're people like FDR and stuff are in that, aren't they? But most of the characters are made up, aren't they? But they do bump into some real. But it's been a long time. I don't think I ever read the book, but I did see the TV show back in the 80s or 90s, wherever the hell that was. So that's interesting. And then Michael Lavin, Emerson Ford, fantastic name and an amazing person. This is the best content you've ever done, Woody. It's really superb. This is poetry and heart and humanity. Well, there you are. Best show ever.
Wow.
Thanks, Michael. So, I mean, one of the things to go back to the subject is, we can talk about the 77th Division if you want to. We can talk about the Blue Raiders again if you want to. But the heart of the book is we're not telling the story today, because the story is for people to go out there and get the book to understand the emotional story there. But it is, as I said at the top of the show, there's sacrifice, there's loss, there's a mystery, and all these elements there. So you said you could happy to talk about the 77th Division. Are there anything particularly remarkable about their service that you discovered in the research of that? And you said, you had to kind of curb your enthusiasm for kind of putting in all the details of their history, but that they were a pretty exceptional unit. But anything struck you as a sort of a non-military historian about what they did in World War II that sets them apart from other divisions, perhaps?
Well, if we want to bring it
a bit older, you said, yeah.
Yeah. Well, if we want to bring it back to the Marines. So the 77th was brought in to fight alongside the Marines in Guam, and the general was not his hopes weren't high. because of his previous experience with the previous division. And the other general was even relieved from duty because of the experience there. And so he said, well, you know what? We're just going to pick and choose some platoons from the 77th and we'll put them in with these Marines. And, we'll just hope for the best. So later we get a few days pass of the battle, and he talks to his Marine commanders on the ground. And he says, okay, how are these 77 guys doing? And remember, they're older. The oldest guy was about 53, who was an infantry soldier. So they're older. There were not a lot of expectations. And they said, you want to know how they're doing? They are one of us. We have now given them the official name of the 77th Marine Division. And so, as we all know, that's the highest praise a Marine can give to another person, is they're one of us. And so I just love that story. I love that these guys proved themselves on Guam, which was their first battle. That's the best one, I think.
I want to drill down on your decision of how much military detail to put in, because I find that really fascinating. Because I'm working on my next book now, and I'm at the sort of self-editing before I write phase. Like, that's a really good story, but I don't think it's actually essential to what the story is I'm trying to tell. And particularly finding the level of detail that seems right, because you did your work in the archives, you've seen the morning reports, the after action reports. It can end up being just lists, and on the 2nd they did this, on the 4th they did this, they moved from this coordinates on to this coordinate there, more patrolling, more men killed. How, as someone from a literature background, teaching it, writing, all that, how do you take that raw information, and people will be watching this and writing notes or taking notes, how do you take that raw information and bake it into a story?
Okay, well, that's a good question. I think you just have to have an eye for what would interest you in a story. So I'll give you an example. In fact, can we pull up the PowerPoint?
Yeah.
Is that possible? Okay, let me go back. I think I actually included this. Yes, I did. Okay, I'm going to read what's on this note here, this message. Small groups of enemy infiltrating in draws north and south of the command post all night. Enemy using bird calls and tapping sounds for signals. Tapping may be enemy hand grenades. That's a story.
Yeah.
That right there is the story. So not necessarily 23rd of July. We pushed off at 0600. We had these weapons with us. You have to find a way to fold those details gently within the story, so it doesn't seem like you're being hit on the head with these facts.
Yeah, I mean that's a very good point, and it's that you say this knowing what to leave out, knowing what to take through and put into a finished work there. And Alt 92 is mentioning that creative writing classes are great for that, which of course they are. How to express yourself, and I think this is the trick with it, is knowing what the audience and what will interest you yourself, because you can get too down into the weeds. And I've read books, it's like there's just too much detail. Now I'm lost. I've now forgotten who everybody is now, because there's too many characters, too many sergeants, too many lieutenants. I've forgotten whether the first lieutenant on the left or on the right now, and I'm struggling to keep up with the actual narrative. And I think that's a trick, and it's not as easy to accomplish as I think some people think it is. There's ways of doing it, but it's complicated. We had a question to go with bounce around with the conversation. You said you didn't particularly read any World War II historical fiction to inspire you for what the science say, but Ian T wants to know, what type of books do you normally read? What's your go-to just for the hell of it books?
Well, I don't know how popular this will be, but I love Dickens. You mentioned Dickens earlier. I love Dickens, C.S. Lewis, Shakespeare, Hamlet, but I teach these things, so I
Yeah.
get really excited by it. But I do want to say that there is one nonfiction World War II historical book that I love, and that is Unbroken. So I have read
Okay.
that one.
Yeah.
She did a fantastic job, and I just want to point out that it's nonfiction, the way she wrote that book. But but it seems as if it's fiction because the story is so alive the way she tells it. So that
As you said that, I'll tell you a kind of a funny story, because when that book came out, whichever year it was, it must be at least 10 years now. So now, and people said to me, "Oh, you got to read it, Paul. You got to read it. It's a brilliant book." And I said, "I know the story because I had read Zamperini's own autobiography that predated Laura's book by whatever it was, 20 years or something."
Mhm.
Um, no disrespect to the late Louis Zamperini, but it wasn't really very well written. It was I struggled with it. And that's why I put off reading Unbroken, because I kept saying, well, I know the story. I know it. Um, and then
Mhm.
finally, I think someone actually gave me a copy of it, and I went, okay, then. And I got, and what a difference a well-written version
Yes.
is compared to a bad. And Louis said as much himself in interviews he did after the Unbroken came out. He said, I now realize why my own book didn't sell, although it has become a collector's item now because he
Oh,
signed some of the copies of it.
yeah.
All of it was there: the hell ships, the Japanese cruelty, the Christianity, all the elements were in his book, but somehow he just failed to kind of put it all together in a way, for me personally, that worked. And so that's a really good example of the story being there, but
Yes.
not the telling of it. Yeah.
Exactly. The showing, not telling. You have to have a good balance there.
Yeah, and I think, let's go back to what we were saying earlier on about the plethora of books that came out in those last few years of veterans, where people were just not rushing out, but quick to kind of get out until and they all have a place. They all have something to offer, and every story that's recorded and every book that gets published is important. But I read quite a few that I just thought, okay, I won't remember this next week. That's the problem.
Mm.
I kind of, I learned from it at the time, but I won't be taking it forward. And with the military history, again, going back to that, is that people will eventually forget which day the campaign started and which
Right.
map coordinate they weren't, but they won't forget the moments of valor. And the other thing, when you said about, more people possibly deserve medals than got them, and I think that's one of the things that, talking to some family members, as we did, I was at a conference in London a couple of weeks ago, is that people think that if their loved one didn't get the Medal of Honor or didn't get the Victoria Cross or didn't have a leg blown off or something and come back to a ticker tape parade, that somehow they weren't a hero, their story wasn't valid. But the fact is, of the millions who served, most of them, the job they did had elements of mundanity to it, but at the
Oh,
same
yeah.
point, they did their job. And so you obviously were lucky enough to find enough key action in there to drive it forward. But if in the case of what you wrote about, the mystery, the intrigue, the emotional feeling of brothers going to war, that would have applied even if they had been in a real line logistics unit, wouldn't they?
Absolutely. I think that everyone's story is important to tell, not just my grandfather's, my uncle's story. Uh, there is a story there, even if it's not whatever it might be. Oh, by the way, I there is a story of a Medal of Honor winner in my
Mm.
story that I did discover, and nothing has been told about him, and that is such a tragedy to me that he's gone. He's gone. People have moved on. Nothing. No one knows about him, and so I said, I'm going to rectify this. So, but you don't have to be, like you said, a Medal of Honor winner. Everyone's story is important. Everyone was there for a purpose, and I believe that even if your uncle, your dad, your grandfather, even if they didn't ever step foot on the battlefield, they were a part of something huge and big and something important on the world stage. And I think you should, if you are interested in telling their story, if you even have the littlest inkling that you want to record that, do it. It's so
Yeah.
worth it, and you will know them by the end of the process. I highly encourage it.
Yeah. I mean, and that's, some of the, we're going off on a massive great detour, but some of the movies that have stayed with me, almost nothing happens. I mean, nothing
Mm,
really happens in the first hour and a half of Shawshank Redemption, for
yeah.
example. But it's a film that I will never forget. Lawrence Arabia as a movie has lots and
Mhm.
lots of talk in between the moments of action, but it's the talk that make the movie,
Yes.
not necessarily the action. I think that's the key there. People are talking about their favorite Dickens now. I think it's probably Great Expectations for me. Trevor Sheehan made the great point about Field Marshal Montgomery's World War II memoirs are close to being historical fiction. That is, I think, there, Trevor, if I'm not mistaken, a bit of a knock at Montgomery there, but I completely agree. Yeah, Montgomery could be a bit fast and loose with the truth there. So we will kind of round things up in a few minutes, but have you got the bug now for this? But the problem is, you've now done the family story. Where would you go next?
Yes. So I have a 2-book contract with my publisher, and my second book comes out in September, and it's also based on the true story of an unsung hero, but this time it's set during the Revolutionary War, so I had to learn a whole new
Right.
one.
Wow.
But I do have the bug, and I imagine that I'll be doing this for the rest of my life because it's so. I believe it's important for me. I believe I'm doing something good for uh, for these people. I'm helping in my own small way and helping their stories to get out there. And
Mm.
it's life giving to me because I enjoy the process so much.
My last question for you is going back to kind of the technical side of things. I know, because I had some of these conversations with potential author, because everyone's a potential author. It's
Cool.
just getting that first word down there. Is that, we were talking before going live. The minute you start talking about a war situation, there are rifles, there are vehicles, there are Amtracs, all that stuff. At what point did you personally feel confident enough to move forward? Because there you are,
Mm.
you're getting to a point, and sadly, you've got to mention an LVT, an Amtrak. You go, okay, so do I need to explain to my readers what that
Yeah.
is? And if I do so, how do I verify that what I'm saying is right? Because people can get very protective over words like tank when it's actually a tank destroyer, or
Yeah.
is it a battleship? In fact, it's a heavy cruiser. So I could sense that people like yourself going into first, you can get really kind of lost and lose all sorts of confidence. But I can't possibly. What if it's the second pattern rifle, not the first pattern?
Oh
How
yeah.
did you deal with that?
Well, I certainly had those moments. And as I mentioned before, there was a fear that someone would read something and say, it wasn't a knee mortar, it was a.
Yeah.
And so that's why I took so long to research this first book. It took me approximately 6 years to research it because I had to start with policies and procedures, weapons, then the campaigns themselves, and there were multiple campaigns.
Yeah.
And then we have the Blue Raiders and the 77th. So uh, it was quite a long journey, but I got there. But one thing my publisher did is help me dumb it down a little bit. So if I'm saying, the M1, she wants me to put rifle. And so to help those who maybe
Mm.
don't know those details, because that can take you out of the story if you're like, okay, LVT. what does that mean? Why is
Yeah.
an LBT different, or how is it different from this? And so that's actually an important part of the Guam landing in my book, is they were not given the right boats to land, and so they couldn't get over the coral. And so I went on my merry way calling things LVTs and LSVTs and all that stuff. And so she helped me to make it more accessible to readers. So that is something I learned, is that not every detail, you don't have to prove that you know something. You can just make it so that way the story is not interrupted by these details.
And ultimately, you're not going to please everybody, because I don't please everybody with my channel. I'm paradoxically too much detail for some people, not enough for other people. My shows are too long and too short. I talk too much, not enough. I do too much Eastern Front content, not enough Eastern Front content. Too much about Normandy, not enough about Normandy. And it's Gordon Ramsay, the chef, says, you just have to accept the fact you'll never please everybody. Someone will go, there wasn't enough military detail, and someone will say there was too much military detail, because we're all different. And that it comes down to the fact that the core of why I wanted to speak to you is these different ways of sharing World War II. There are your classic campaign study books where it is blow by blow, battalion, company, and they have their place, and I have a lot of them. And then there are these types of books that have that element in there, but they are about people, and it's all sharing history. So there's no bad way to do it. Any final bit of advice you would think, because I know a lot of people watching this are thinking of doing a book. I know advice isn't always transferable, but any other kind of things that you would proffer as advice?
Well, unfortunately, you probably don't have your relatives are probably not alive anymore to interview. They might possibly be, but that is quickly passing that opportunity. So the next best thing are letters, and then talking to those who did know them, who spoke with them. Maybe they told their stories to their sons, their daughters, and so start there, and then start digging. And if you don't mind, I wanted to read something.
Please do.
Okay. This is my whole reason for writing. So I posted this on my my Instagram page, and it was under a picture of my grandfather's plane. This is a picture of my grandfather's plane flying away after strafing an enemy ship. I knew him only as my Papa Jim, the man who blubbered when he saw me on my wedding day, the ground center of any family shenanigans, a lodestone who drew strangers and friends alike. But I didn't know him as the gunner who destroyed the ship in the picture. He and his crew would fly 2,000 miles over open sea every mission, alone, in the dark, and on a plane notorious for its tendency to fall apart and hurtle into the sea. Was he scared? Did he think himself invincible? At 19, probably. I wish I would have asked him what it was like. Instead, I had to find out by poring over books written by those who knew more than I did about my own grandfather. I had to wear gloves to handle fragile, fading records stored in temperature-controlled archives. It was practically surgical, combing through records for the tiniest scrap of information that could give me what I wanted to know. Him as a young man who left his home in 1944, fighting for a cause at the risk of life and limb. He came home and moved on, leaving behind his losses like ash scattered on foreign sands. Except I don't think they were left behind. Not really. I don't think those kinds of things can be forgotten. I write because I don't want his life lost to some fluorescent lit archive. When I spend time with him in my story, it's like he's alive again, telling me about the side of him I never got to know. What a gift. So
Wow.
I believe so I think maybe some of you can relate to that. And if your motivation is to know who they really were, and to get to know that side of them that you you might never know otherwise.
Mm.
I just do it. Do it. It's one of the best memories of my life.
Mm. Well, you've sold a few copies to the viewing. I don't want to go back and kind of undermine the eloquence of what you just said there and that passage you wrote there. But I did just think of something you said about the letters. I want to just pick up on is that coming from English literature background and teaching and writing is that the language in letters written in the war can be a little bit weird, and there's issues of censorship and people not necessarily revealing. You didn't want to tell your mum, for example, that you were terrified of dying every single day, so you would write letters about, yes, we played cards yesterday, we went to the pub again. You must have had to have learned completely to read through the lines on that stuff. So get to understand the way people wrote 80 years ago, and also to learn what they didn't say, but what they were obviously getting. And that's, you obviously kind of had to fill in some of the gaps with the imagination, but that must have been a process, just learning how to decode the letters.
That's so interesting that you bring that up. That's a great point. I can actually match up one of the letters with a battle that one of them was in, and it was a horrific battle, one of the bloodiest of the Pacific campaign. And he's writing home and he's saying, yeah, there's really not much going on over here. I'm pretty bored, wish I was home with you. And I thought, well, not quite, but I understand why he said what he did. And so, just heartbreaking to think about that so many couldn't really share the full story in their letters.
Which I think neatly ties up with the conversation with the idea of, in your case, and possibly with other people, historical fiction is the way to uncover the story behind the data you've got. In that, if you didn't add all this color, it would, as we keep saying, just could end up being just a list of dates and transposing the letters, which, as you just said there is a battle going on that's one of the most bloody and devastating in World War II. Yeah, not doing very much today. And I have read books where they have put those type of letters in. I'm thinking that, but you've missed the point of that. He's obviously not talking about that because it was so horrific. That was he's putting pen to paper the day after his best friend got killed. So of course he's not going to talk about that. So yeah, that brings it around the idea of having a story, having a point, having an intention of what the project should be. So, well, I mean, people are saying you should come back and do a 77th Division Pro show, just a completely new. We'd be happy for that. We'd be come back and do a Blue Raiders show, or you can come back on and when you've done your third book, if you go back to World War II, that would be good. But anyway, it's been delightful talking to you. You know what to do, folks. Go and get a book. And maybe it's one of those kind of books that you can proudly share to family members, as opposed to some of the crusty military ones that you kind of keep for yourself. And I'm looking at you, the middle-aged guys like me in the audience, particularly there. So yeah, fantastic. A book for everybody. So it's been fantastic talking to you. Folks, I'm back again on Monday. 2 shows, Kate Vigers and Stephen Fisher. Click like and subscribe, buy my guest books, and consider becoming a channel member or a Patreon. Thanks for watching. Enjoy the weekend, everybody. Bye.
Thanks for having me. Bye.